Grizzly Tooth Valley, autumn 1888. When Elias Thorne began building the second wall, his neighbors were convinced the solitude had finally broken him. They stood at the edge of his property, arms crossed, watching him erect a strange, skeletal frame of pine 4x4s around his perfectly good, newly built log cabin. The frame stood a full 18 inches away from the sturdy log walls, creating a useless, drafty-looking gap. It was an act of profound public foolishness. Silas Blackwood, a man whose hands had chinked half the cabins in the valley, spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "He's building a crib for his own house," Blackwood declared to the small audience of onlookers, "wasting good timber on a ghost wall. He'll be heating the valley all winter with that contraption." Elias, a quiet man with the sea in his eyes, offered no explanation. He just kept working, his hammer blows precise and rhythmic. He was a former shipwright from the coast, a man accustomed to the logic of hulls and tides, not the ingrained traditions of mountain survival. His neighbors saw a fool. They saw a man building a monument to his own ignorance, a flimsy cage around a solid home. What did this soft-spoken outsider, this man who smelled of salt and tar, understand about the biting, soul-crushing cold of a mountain winter that generations of hardened woodsmen had somehow missed? Before we unpack the secrets hidden within that strange, hay-stuffed wall, take a moment to support our channel. If you appreciate stories of forgotten history and practical genius, please click the like button and subscribe for more content. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to the problem that Elias Thorne was trying to solve, a problem far more dangerous than his neighbors' ridicule. To understand the madness of Elias Thorne's method, you first have to understand the misery of a conventional winter in Grizzly Tooth Valley. It was not a gentle, picturesque season. It was a siege. The cold was an active predator, a physical entity that seeped through the thickest logs, found every hairline crack in the chinking, and settled deep into the bones of the people living there. A standard cabin, even one built by a master like Silas Blackwood, was a fortress under constant assault. The heart of the home was the cast-iron stove, a ravenous beast that had to be fed around the clock. The life of every family was dictated by the woodpile. Mornings were a frantic, shivering race to coax embers back to life. Days were a blur of sawing and splitting, hauling wood that was often green and damp, which hissed and smoked and filled the cabin with an acrid haze that stung the eyes and soured the lungs. The inefficiency was staggering. A family might burn through 6, 7, even 8 cords of wood in a single winter. An entire summer's labor turned to ash just to maintain a state of not quite freezing. Comfort was a distant dream. There was only the small, shrinking circle of survivable warmth around the stove. To move more than 10 feet from its heat was to enter another climate zone. Water buckets left near the door would freeze solid. Frost would bloom on the heads of iron nails driven into the interior walls, ghostly white flowers of penetrating cold. Families slept in layers of wool and fur, their breath pluming in the air of their own bedrooms. It was a life of perpetual, exhausting defense, and the cold always seemed to be winning. Elias had endured one such winter, watching his wife Anna cough through the long nights, her frail frame trembling in the damp, smoky air. He swore he would not let her suffer through another. Elias was not a woodsman, but he was a master of structure. For 20 years, he had built fishing schooners on the North Atlantic coast, vessels designed to withstand the fury of the ocean. He understood that a wall was not just a barrier, it was a system. He knew that the greatest enemy of a wooden structure was not force, but moisture. Water was relentless, and it carried the cold with it. He had learned the principle of the double hull, where an inner and outer skin created a space that added immense strength and insulation. He had seen fishermen pack their holds with sawdust and ice to preserve their catch for weeks, marveling at how a simple layer of trapped air and organic fiber could so effectively defy the summer sun. He did not look at his cabin and see a house. He saw a hull that needed to be protected. He did not trust the valley's folklore about logs needing to breathe. He trusted the unyielding laws of physics he had learned at sea, and those laws told him that the traditional log cabin was a catastrophically flawed design. It was a sieve for heat, a sponge for moisture, and a machine for burning firewood. His solution began not with the walls, but with the ground. Before the first log was even laid, Elias had spent a week digging a trench 2 feet deep and 2 feet wide around the entire perimeter of his cabin's foundation. His neighbors had chuckled, assuming he was digging a root cellar in the wrong place. But Elias was creating a French drain. He hauled dozens of wheelbarrows of graded stone from the riverbed and filled the trench, creating a porous barrier that would actively pull water away from the foundation logs. He knew that moisture wicked up from the damp earth, carrying the chill into the very bones of the structure. His first principle was to keep the foundation dry. A dry ship is a sound ship. A dry cabin, he reasoned, would be a warm cabin. Only then did he build the log structure, a simple, sturdy box of saddle-notched pine, chinked tightly with a mixture of mud and moss. It looked like any other cabin in the valley, and for a few weeks his neighbors thought he had finally come to his senses. Then came the exoskeleton. He began erecting a secondary non-structural frame of lighter 4x4 posts anchored to outriggers extending from the foundation. He meticulously placed each post precisely 18 inches from the outer surface of the log wall. This was the measurement that drew the most scorn, 18 inches. It was a vast, seemingly pointless gap. He connected the posts with horizontal timbers, creating a grid-like cage around the entire building, from the stone foundation to the eaves of the roof. This was the space where his true innovation would live. Next came the hay. For this, he was methodical. It was not just any field grass. He had bartered for several acres of late-season Timothy hay, cut on a dry week and allowed to cure perfectly in the sun. It had to be bone-dry. Then, using a hand-cranked baler he had built himself from gears and lumber, he compressed the hay into dense, rectangular bales of uniform size and weight. While this was happening, another delivery arrived from the railway depot down in the flats, several large, heavy rolls of tar-impregnated sheathing paper. It was a material used in shipbuilding to create a waterproof membrane within a vessel's hull. The sight of it confirmed to Silas Blackwood and the others that Thorne was truly lost to some coastal madness. With painstaking care, Elias and Anna began wrapping each individual hay bale in the tar paper. They folded the edges like a gift, sealing every seam with a layer of hot pine pitch. It was slow, sticky, arduous work. The neighbors' jokes grew more pointed. "Look at him!" one man cackled from the road. "He's wrapping grass like a Christmas present for the mice." "That's Thorne's folly," another named it, and the name stuck. The haystack house. Undeterred, Elias began stacking the wrapped bales into the 18-inch cavity between the log wall and the outer frame. He used levers and wedges to compress them vertically and horizontally, ensuring there were no gaps, no air pockets. The wall of hay grew, a dark, monolithic layer of insulation, 18 inches thick, protected from the elements. Once the cavity was filled to the eaves, he began cladding the outer skeleton. He used rough-sawn pine boards, nailed vertically, but here again, his shipwright's precision revealed a hidden purpose. He did not nail the boards flush to the ground. He left a 1-inch gap at the very bottom, which he covered with a fine wire mesh to prevent pests from entering. He left a similar 1-inch gap at the very top, tucked discreetly under the overhang of the roof. His house now had 3 walls, an inner wall of solid log, a middle wall of dense paper-wrapped hay, and an outer wall of pine boards. And between each wall there was a carefully engineered space. To the untrained eye it was a monstrosity, a bulky, featureless box. But to Elias it was a perfectly tuned instrument for survival. He had built a system based on principles the valley had never considered. He had built a wall that did not just fight the cold, it outsmarted it. The science behind Thorne's folly was both simple and revolutionary, and it began with a concept utterly foreign to the cabin builders of Grizzly Tooth Valley, the R value. R value is a simple measurement of thermal resistance, or how well a material can stop the flow of heat. The higher the R value, the better the insulation. A standard, well-built log wall made from 12-inch thick pine logs, like the ones in Silas Blackwood's own highly respected cabin, has an R value of approximately 15. For a cool autumn evening, R15 is adequate. For the brutal, sub-zero onslaught of a mountain winter, R15 is a pittance. It forces a constant, ferocious burning of fuel simply to replace the heat that is perpetually leaking out through the walls and roof. Elias, through observation and calculation, knew that dry, densely packed organic fiber was a phenomenal insulator. A single inch of compressed hay has an R value of about 2.5. Elias hadn't built a wall that was a few inches thick. He had built a wall of pure insulation that was 18 inches thick. 18 inches multiplied by an R value of 2.5 per inch gave his hay wall a staggering R value of 45. When combined with the inner log wall's R15 and a small additional value from the air gaps and the outer cladding, Elias Thorne's complete wall system had a total thermal resistance of over R60. He had built a wall that was, by the numbers, 4 times more effective at holding heat than the best cabin in the valley. 4 times. It was a quantitative leap in performance so vast it was almost unimaginable. R60 versus R15. This was the core of his genius. But insulation alone was not enough. Elias knew the true enemy was moisture. A wet ship sinks, and a wet wall fails. This was the purpose of his multi-layered design. The first air gap, the space between the inner log wall and the hay bales, acted as a thermal break. It prevented the warmth of the logs from directly conducting to the outer layers, but more critically, it acted as a capillary break. Any moisture vapor moving through the logs from the inside of the cabin would hit this airspace and stop, unable to bridge the gap and saturate the hay insulation. This alone was a brilliant innovation, but the true masterstroke was the design of the outermost layer. The vertical pine boards with the vented gaps at the top and bottom created what modern builders would call a rain screen. This was the shipwright's ultimate secret. Any ambient moisture in the air, any driven rain that got past the boards, or any condensation that formed within the wall system would be dealt with by this feature. The slight temperature difference between the air inside the gap and the air outside would create a slow, constant convection current. Air would be drawn in through the meshed gap at the bottom, rise as it warmed, collect any moisture vapor, and exhaust it through the gap at the top. His wall was designed to breathe. It was designed to stay permanently dry. He had not, as Silas Blackwood claimed, suffocated his logs. He had given them a permanent breathable raincoat. He had built a system that managed heat and moisture with a scientific elegance that was completely invisible to his detractors. They saw a clumsy box. He had engineered a high-performance thermal envelope. The social conflict began in earnest at Miller's trading post, the valley's hub of commerce and gossip. Silas Blackwood, holding a mug of coffee, pontificated to a captive audience of trappers and homesteaders. He was not a cruel man, but he was a proud one, and he saw Thorne's strange creation as an implicit insult to his life's work. "Mark my words," Silas said, his voice resonating with the authority of experience. "A log needs to breathe. It has to be able to take in and release moisture with the seasons. He's wrapped his cabin in tar paper like it's a piece of salted meat. The logs will sweat, and with nowhere for the damp to go, it'll turn to rot. By spring, the chinking will be mush, and the logs will be soft as punkwood." He took a sip of coffee and warmed to his subject. "And that's if it lasts till spring. He's built a home for every mouse, rat, and weasel in this valley. They'll chew through that paper in a week to get at the hay. He'll be living inside a rustling, squeaking nest by Christmas. His walls will be riddled with tunnels, destroying any warmth he thinks he's trapping." He set his mug down with a conclusive thud. "But the real danger, the thing that keeps me up at night for his poor wife's sake, is the fire risk. One stray spark from that chimney lands on that dry pine cladding, and the whole thing goes up like a torch. That hay will smolder and burn for days. It's not a home, it's a pyre he's built. It's a monument to fear, not a work of sound engineering." The community absorbed his pronouncements as gospel. Thorne's folly became a common joke. Men riding past his homestead would cup their hands to their mouths and make squeaking mouse sounds. Children were warned by their parents not to play near the tinderbox house. The ridicule was constant, a low-grade social pressure that weighed heavily on the small family. It was one thing for Elias to endure it. He was insulated by his quiet confidence in his own calculations. It was another for his wife, Anna. One evening, as Elias sat by the stove oiling a tool, Anna paused her mending and looked at him, her brow furrowed with worry. The first snows had already dusted the high peaks, and the air had a sharp, biting edge. "Elias," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "are you certain about this? About the walls?" He looked up, his expression calm. "I am." "Mr. Blackwood has built every strong house in this valley," she pressed, twisting a loose thread in her hands. "He was at the post today. He told Martha Hemlock that our walls will be full of damp and mold before the first real freeze. He said we'll be sick from it. Is he wrong? Can a man with so much experience be so wrong?" Elias put down his tool and walked over to her. He knelt by her chair and took her hand. It was cold. "Anna," he said softly, "a ship's hull is just a wall that holds out an entire ocean. It spends its life soaked in salt water, yet the inside stays dry. This wall only has to hold out the cold air. The principles are the same. It's about keeping the core dry and trapping a layer of still air. That's all insulation is." He led her to the wall and placed her hand against the interior logs. "Feel this. It's just a log wall, solid, strong. Everything else is just a coat we've put on the outside. It's a coat that breathes. Trust the principles, Anna, not the talk. We will be warm. We will be dry. I promise you." His conviction was a comfort, but as the temperature continued to drop, a small seed of doubt remained in her heart. She was staking her health and her family's safety on her husband's strange, unproven theory against the collected wisdom of the entire valley.
The winter of 1888 arrived like a judgment. It began with a heavy wet snow in November that bent saplings to the ground.
By mid-December, the temperature had dropped below zero and stayed there. But it was in January of 1889 that the season turned from harsh to historic. A monolithic wave of Arctic air descended upon the region and did not leave. Locals would speak of it for the next 80 years. They called it the Great Freeze. For 23 consecutive days, the temperature in Grizzly Tooth Valley never rose above minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit. For more than a week, it hovered at a soul-crushing minus 38. The wind was a constant keening force, driving the cold into every crack and crevice. The snow piled up in monumental drifts that buried fence lines and made travel impossible. The sun was a pale, heatless smear in a metallic gray sky. The world seemed to be broken. Inside the valley's conventional cabins, life became a grim battle for survival. In Silas Blackwood's home, the masterpiece of traditional construction, the family lived in a state of siege. The great stone fireplace and the cast-iron stove were both kept roaring, consuming a terrifying amount of seasoned oak and maple. Silas was up 3 times a night to feed the fires, yet the cold was relentless. His wife and children huddled in the small pool of warmth, wrapped in every blanket and quilt they owned. The windows were opaque, with a thick fern-like layer of interior frost. A bucket of water left just inside the door, no more than 12 feet from the blazing stove, was frozen solid by morning. The walls themselves seemed to radiate a deep, penetrating cold. Sickness began to creep through the valley. A persistent rattling cough was heard in nearly every home, a symptom of lungs irritated by cold, smoky air and weakened by the constant stress of shivering. It was a time of pure, unmitigated misery. Then there was the Thorne cabin. Inside Thorne's folly, the world was different. The silence was the first thing one would notice. There was no roaring fire, no constant frantic stoking. The small, efficient wood stove glowed with a gentle, steady heat, consuming only a few logs at a time. The air was warm, not just near the stove, but everywhere. It was an even, stable, comfortable warmth that filled the entire space. Elias sat at the table in his shirt sleeves, calmly repairing a piece of leather harness. Anna, her cheeks flushed with a healthy warmth, kneaded a batch of bread, her movements unhurried. Her cough was gone. Their young son, Daniel, played with a set of wooden blocks on the floorboards. The floor itself was draft-free and remarkably warm to the touch. The air was clean and dry. There was no smoke, no damp chill, no frost on the nail-heads. They were not just surviving the Great Freeze, they were living comfortably through it. The moment of revelation came during the peak of the cold snap. A neighbor, a young homesteader named Thomas Finch, ran out of firewood for his ailing wife. His own woodpile was buried under an 8-foot drift, and in desperation he fought his way through the blizzard to Thorne's cabin, the only one within what he thought was a survivable distance. He stumbled onto the porch, half frozen, and beat a weak rhythm on the door. When Elias opened it, Finch was hit by a wave of warmth, so profound and so unexpected, it almost knocked him over. It was not the scorching, smoky heat of a roaring stove, but a silent, radiant, enveloping warmth. He staggered inside, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Elias in his simple shirt. He saw Anna humming by the counter. He saw the child playing on the floor. "My God, Thorne!" Finch stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as his body tried to adjust. It's like summer in here. How?" When the Great Freeze finally broke in early February, leaving a battered and exhausted valley in its wake, the stories began to circulate. They started with Thomas Finch, who spoke with wide-eyed wonder of the impossible warmth inside Thorne's folly. The stories were initially dismissed as the ramblings of a man addled by cold, but they persisted. The whispers grew into a murmur of genuine curiosity. How had the Fool's House, the Haystack House, performed during the worst winter in living memory? The question gnawed at Silas Blackwood. He was a man of immense pride, but he was also a man of deep integrity. He had publicly condemned Thorne's design as a death trap. Yet Thorne and his family had emerged from the ordeal healthier and more comfortable than anyone else. It made no sense. It defied everything he knew. He had to see for himself. He would not rely on gossip. He would rely on science. He went to the freight agent at the railway depot and borrowed the company's new, officially calibrated mercury thermometer, a precise instrument of fact. He chose a day that was still brutally cold. The thermometer on the porch of the trading post read -25 degrees Fahrenheit. Blackwood, accompanied by the skeptical trading post owner as a witness, went first to his own home. He wanted a baseline. He placed the scientific thermometer on the table in his main room, approximately 6 feet from his well-stoked stove. After 10 minutes, the reading stabilized. 58 degrees. A respectable temperature, he thought, though it came at the cost of a roaring fire. He then pressed the bulb of the thermometer against the inside surface of his expertly chinked log wall. The mercury plummeted. The reading, 34 degrees, just 2 degrees above freezing. The wall was a heat sink, actively pulling warmth from the room. Then they walked the quarter-mile to Thorne's Folly. Elias greeted them calmly and invited them inside. As with Finch, the immediate sensation was one of profound, even warmth. There was no draft. The air was still and pleasant. Blackwood placed the calibrated thermometer on the central table in a spot analogous to where he had measured in his own cabin. The two men watched in silence as the mercury settled. The final reading was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, a full 14 degrees warmer than his own home, with a fire in the stove that was less than half the size of his own. Elias, seeing the look of stunned disbelief on Blackwood's face, gestured to the wall. "Try it there," he suggested quietly. Blackwood, his hand trembling slightly, pressed the thermometer against the interior log wall. This was the moment of truth. He expected it to be cold, perhaps not as cold as his own, but cold nonetheless. He watched the mercury. It barely moved. After 5 minutes, it gave its unbelievable verdict, 68 degrees. The wall itself was warm. It was not stealing heat from the room. It was holding it, radiating it back into the living space like a massive, gentle radiator. The cabin was not just a container for heat, it was a thermal battery. The final piece of evidence was the most damning. Elias led the two men outside to his woodshed. He showed them his woodpile. Throughout the entire 23-day ordeal of the Great Freeze, he had burned just under half a cord of wood. Blackwood felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He, a man who prided himself on efficiency, had burned through nearly 2 full cords in that same period, just to keep his family from freezing. The hard numbers were undeniable, irrefutable and crushing. Thorne's cabin was demonstrably scientifically superior. It was nearly 25% warmer while consuming 75% less fuel. Silas Blackwood stood in the center of Elias Thorne's warm, quiet cabin. He looked from the thermometer to the small placid fire, to Anna Thorne's healthy face, and finally to Elias. The proud set of his shoulders slumped. The certainty in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, weary respect. He was silent for a long time, the only sound in the room the gentle ticking of a mantel clock. He had built his entire reputation on a set of principles that had just been proven comprehensively wrong. He took a deep breath. "I was wrong," Blackwood said, his voice clear and steady, devoid of excuse. "I built walls to fight the cold. You built a wall that understands it." He looked Elias directly in the eye. "I was simply completely wrong. This works." That simple public concession from the Valley's most respected builder changed everything. The story of the measurements of the 72-degree interior and the 68-degree wall spread like a wildfire. Thorne's folly was no longer a joke, it was a miracle. That spring, as the snow melted to reveal a valley scarred by the harsh winter, 2 homesteaders came to Elias Thorne, hat in hand, and asked if he would show them his drawings. He did. By the following autumn, on the eve of the next winter, 5 new cabins stood in the valley, all built with a strange, bulky 18-inch gap between 2 walls. They were called Thorne Walls. In a final, stunning act of humility and progress, Silas Blackwood himself, preparing to build a new home for his eldest son, walked to Elias's cabin and formally asked for a consultation. The ridicule had fully transformed into reverence. The long-term impact on Grizzly Tooth Valley was profound. Over the next decade, the Thorne Wall became the new standard. The change was visible not just in the architecture, but in the people. The brutal, all-consuming labor of winter survival eased. With fuel needs cut by more than 2/3, men had more time and energy. They could clear more land, build better fences, tend to their livestock with greater care. The economic output of the valley increased. More importantly, the health of the community improved dramatically. The persistent winter coughs and deadly pneumonias that had plagued the valley for generations became far less common. Families were no longer living in damp, smoky, drafty cabins. Children grew up healthier and stronger. The quality of life, the very dignity of their existence, was fundamentally elevated by the simple, elegant principles of a quiet shipwright. Elias Thorne, with his deep understanding of moisture, air gaps, and insulation, had unknowingly pioneered the core concepts of modern building science a full century ahead of his time. What his neighbors had mocked as a ghost wall was, in fact, a high-performance, continuously insulated thermal envelope. The outer sheathing, with its vented air gap at the top and bottom, is a principle known today as the rain screen, a sophisticated method for managing moisture and ensuring the longevity of a structure. His obsessive focus on a dry foundation and the separation of materials was a precursor to modern theories of capillary breaks and moisture management. He had not simply built a better cabin, he had created a blueprint for sustainable, resilient living in a harsh climate. The story of the hay-wrapped cabin is more than a tale of clever engineering. It is a powerful lesson in the conflict between tradition and innovation, between dogma and data. Silas Blackwood and the people of the valley were not foolish. They were following generations of hard-won knowledge. Their mistake was in believing that their knowledge was complete, that there were no better ways to be found. Elias Thorne's triumph was a victory for first principles thinking, the act of breaking a problem down to its fundamental truths and building a solution from there, free from the bias of how it has always been done. It is a testament to the quiet courage of the innovator, the humility of the expert who can admit error, and the simple world-changing power of a truly good idea. Thank you for joining us for this story. If you found it inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of forgotten history. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Would you have trusted Thorne's radical design, or would you have sided with the traditionalists? And be sure to join us next time when we investigate the mysterious disappearance of the Great Lakes schooner, the Jupiter. The historical events, characters, and building techniques described in this video are presented for educational and entertainment purposes only. The construction methods depicted are historical and may not meet modern building codes, safety standards, or engineering requirements. Any construction or renovation project should be undertaken only with the guidance of licensed and qualified professionals and in full compliance with all local laws, codes, and regulations. Do not attempt to replicate historical building techniques without professional consultation.